Next up is authenticating users using a remote database. So we have a couple options there. As you can see here, we have Radius, TAGX, and LDAP. So TAGX being the Cisco proprietary protocol, Radius being the open source protocol, and LDAP being a connection with Active Directory. Of course, I can connect to Active Directory using Radius as well, because the server I set up is an Active Directory and a Radius server in the same time. So we can do two things at the same time. I will first focus on Radius because it's a little easier than LDAP, and I will show you how to set that up. It is no different from any other Radius configuration. So we start by creating a Radius server. So what is the Radius server that we are going to use? That is the 10.10.2.10.141. The shared key that I'm using is CCIE Data Center, CCIE DC, by running default ports, default timeouts. So I created the server. I have a couple options here. This is my provider, or the Radius server. Now, I can have multiple Radius servers authenticating the same users for high availability reasons, and those servers need to be placed into a group. I need a provider group in terms to enable the authentication, so I will always need a provider group. So this is my Radius provider group, and I place my only Radius server that I have in the group. Create the group. Then I go into my global authentication configuration, and here I can configure multiple things. So first of all, if I do not select anything, what kind of authentication do I do? So if I do not select anything at login, what do I use to log in from? Meaning, if I go back to that web page and I say launch UCS Manager, during login, I get a special drop-down box. In that special drop-down box, I can select which type of authentication that I want to use. Meaning, I configure different domains. So I can configure a local domain. In this case, LDAP is a previously configured domain, meaning that there will be some LDAP servers configured as well. So I will remove them before. But here, this drop-down box is my authentication domain. If I select native, which is the default, I will use these settings that I mentioned here. So choosing local database with certain refresh timeouts, and for the SSH sessions, so the console, no, not SSH, the console sessions, they will use local database as well. Another very important statement here is what I just said is if I configure a local database user, just on the UCS itself here in locally authenticated users, I will always get the read-only role. And that read-only role will always give me access to everything in the system. In the system, I can check everything and I can verify everything. But for remote users, that's differently. I might have 4,000 LDAP users in my Active Directory, but not all 4,000 are allowed to access the UCS, maybe. It's probably a good reason to block some people here. So in that case, the default policy here for remote users, so everybody who is authenticating using a server, is not allowed to log in. Or I can say assign the default role to that user. So default role meaning the read-only role. If I do not, what I mean with this is if I do not specify any Radius group, any group mapping, so any pushing of an attribute using the group, do I allow login for that user or not? So do I require the user to get a certain role pushed in its attributes, or do I not? If I do not, I will allow the default role. Now for my client that I have configured, I do not have a current role being pushed, so I'm going to assign the default role to remote users. Next, as I showed you, I can select exactly which domain I want to have. So local is the default. It will always choose local authentication as being native. Actually, I can delete this as well and just rely on native authentication. So native authentication is the option that I always have, and domains I can configure. So in my case, for Radius, I'm going to configure a domain, meaning an option in that drop-down box. I'm going to call it Radius. I'm going to say you are using Radius authentication using that specific provider group. And now I can start logging in through users that I have defined in my Radius configuration. I need to check what kind of user I already created there. Window. The 141, where is it? So I'm setting up my session towards my Active Directory and Radius server. And that failed. Maybe it's called data center. It's a bit slow, but it should work. There we go. So this is my Radius server. Let's check what users I created. This one, users and computers. I have administrator, I have network user, that's one. That is called network user, and I know the password, so I should be able to log in using the username of network user through Radius. So now, because I created that authentication domain and I created the provider group, I should have a new option available here in my drop-down box. As soon as the Java tools start, I should be able to select the Radius group, which I'm not. Maybe it requires a refresh. I configured my Radius authentication domain, changes have been saved. Native authentication has been changed to accept the default role. So that should mean that I have access to it. All right, launch the UCS manager. I'm having some caching issues in Java. Java is always pretty not helping with anything related to this. And delete the files. All right, so as soon as I start this, I should now start downloading the application again. There we go. For some reason, it's still caching something. I am on this system. I configured the proper, maybe because I need to close all the UCS managers. It's just, okay. Clear the Java cache. Delete everything. Cool. Now, let's go into not helping on Java is slow. There we go. Now please work. There we go. So it took some time, but now we can select both the native and the newly configured authentication group. And as I said, I configured username called network user in my Active Directory with a certain password. And that should be able to log in now. So that network user guy, I did not specify it in my local authentication database. And now it should log in to the UCS. Now my VPN dropped as well. Authentication failed. Why is that? That might be an issue on my side. Oh, right. I allowed the wrong group. All right, so that was my radius misconfiguration. Still not. View a log. .10.10.81 verify. There we go. It's using a different source address. It's using the source address from the UCS Fabric Interconnect. So again, configuration mismatch on my radius configuration. Because as you can see now, I'm logged in as being the network user that is authenticated through radius. Because I'm not pushing a role, I'm in the read-only role. So sorry that it took a little bit longer, but my radius authentication did succeed, and it is using as a source address the physical IP address of the Fabric Interconnect. So in my radius configuration, I only allowed the virtual IP address, the 81, but it is using the 82 as a source, because after I enabled that, my login worked. So this is my radius configuration.